I'm joined right now by Harold Coe, a law professor at Yale University and a former State Department legal advisor, and constitutional lawyer David Rivkin, who was a White House legal advisor in the Reagan administration. Professor Coe, you first, and what do you think should decide this case? Is it the merits in terms of national security and the president's judgment? Is it the constitutional ban on any establishment of religion? What is the key factor that you would look to in deciding a case like this, either at the appellate or at the district level?
I think the question is whether the status quo is defective and whether we needed this Muslim ban. If it was a terrorist ban, then why don't they go against countries that actually sent us terrorists? Instead, they went against a bunch of countries where not a single person caused a fatal terrorist attack. And so at the district court, the judge said, I want to make a ruling based on fact or based on fiction, and I'd rather do it based on fact. Now, what happened here was there were two issues. One, can the president use his authority to issue such a sweeping order not connected to fact? And if he does, are his actions reviewable by a court? The appeals court that just heard the case was very skeptical about the notion that you couldn't review it. And they were very skeptical about the notion that Washington couldn't come in to plead the rights of its citizens. So they started talking about the merits, and then they made a basic point, which is that if you call something a Muslim ban, and then you call it something different, you can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig.
What about Hezbollah? Do you think you don't think Iran is a threat to the United States in terms of Hezbollah and its support for that terrorist group around the world? How can you argue that Hezbollah is not our enemy? Forget the religion.
I'm not arguing that, Chris.
But you said that these countries don't pose a threat to us because of, the way they calculate the history. But certainly in real time, right now, Hezbollah is our problem. It's a danger to us, isn't it, from Iran?
The question is, what kind of system do we need? And the system that we had was extreme vetting. So President Trump said, I want extreme vetting. What he didn't notice is that's what we already had. It's an individualized determination. It's not group-based. This is not a country that makes determinations about people based on stereotypes about their background. It's based on the content of individual character. And so we had a system where if you pose a threat, then you have to be individually extremely vetted. And they proved that there was no new threat. So the national security officials who filed the declaration, you saw their brief. It included 2 secretaries of state, 4 former directors of the CIA, 4 people who were on the threat stream, Chris, 1 week before. And they said, there is no new threat. And our system, there's no reason to think it's not working. So if you're going to shift...
I'm just curious, how do you know, as a legal scholar, where our threat comes from? I mean, Hezbollah works out of Lebanon, but it's actually being financed always by Iran. We know that. The Shia are behind it. They are Shia. This is very complicated. And if you are a judge and you're wrong about this, and we do suffer an attack from one of these countries, what do you say? It's not my fault. What do you say to the public as a judge?
What the judge said to the government, what the judge said to the government is, prove there's a threat that's not being addressed by the existing system. Where is the evidence?
Subsequent to this ruling. Subsequent to this ruling. But presidents are responsible for the future, not the past. The president's responsible.
Where is the evidence that there's a new threat? Where is the evidence of a new threat?
I'm just asking you in terms of consequence. Are judges immune to consequence?
No, but judges have to rely on facts, and they have to rely on whether the response to the facts is consistent with the law. And they said that the president was doing neither. He had no facts, and he was acting outside the law.
Fact. Sure, except if it was all empirical, we'd have this thing beaten by now in terrorism. Here's an exchange between...
1 week before, all of these officials who signed this declaration said we were current with the threat stream, and we did not think it would be addressed by this. It was going to be addressed by our existing system of individualized vetting. In other words, if you think it's problematic, turn up the screws. Instead, they suddenly say, let's throw away the whole machine. Let's put in a broad ban. And then the ban turns out not to be based on fact. So you don't get deference for being president when you don't make a reasoned decision or throw out procedures that are working without explanation and causing chaos in the process, as we've all known.
We'll get back to this later, sir, but I was talking about where the buck stops, and in the end, it's the president's responsible for what happens tomorrow, next week, next year, and in this case, for the next 4 years. Mr. Rivkin, how do you respond to that question about whether this is, in fact, a Muslim Muslim ban?
It is not a Muslim ban for a variety of reasons, but let me just point the most cogent. The notion that federal judges are equipped to second-guess a threat assessment performed on the basis of objective intelligence, and yes, the previous administration officials, Chris, had the same intelligence. But we're talking about discretionary judgments about what is the acceptable level of risk.
Well, what are the limits on a president's power in the Constitution, do you hear? In this case, what's the limit?
In this area.
If it was an outright Muslim ban, could he get away with it?
I would be troubled by an outright Muslim ban.
Would the president still have the authority, do you think?
It is not a Muslim ban.
No, if it were. It's being called that. If it were, in principle, it would be an Establishment Clause issue, a First Amendment issue.
Well, we have a problem. I have a problem with the notion that states can vindicate free exercise arguments. But if you had an individual who can make this argument, I would be troubled. But let me emphasize, we now have two political branches that both structurally, with a delegation of the president authority to exclude certain classes of aliens based upon his discretionary determination, plus his constitutional authority over foreign affairs, and his caseload says immigration decisions were made. So both political branches structurally came together, putting in the highest quadrant of young Stalin, of Stu Caesar's case, the famous Justice Jackson's concurrence. And we have both executive and congressional determinations that these countries are the countries of concern, where my colleague Harold misses the boat entirely. How you slice this, how you treat the concern, and whatever measures, he says extreme vetting. That's not the decision of a previous administration official, the decision of this administration officials. And by the way, not only does countries breed terrorism, but countries by and large have conditions on the ground, their high quality vetting in the judgment of this administration, Chris, is impossible. And the notion that that judgment can be gainsaid by Article 3 judges is just risible. That's not at all something they're institutionally capable of.
So you think it's legal for a president to have a permanent ban on the country's entry into the United States? You could make a list of countries and say, for the foreseeable future, we're not letting anybody in from those countries. You say that would be within his authority?
If we have particularly a situation where both political branches have blessed it, I think it would be entirely constitutional. But if I can briefly focus on the standing issue, my prediction is that this would be dismissed on standing grounds.
You predict this will go that way with the president. Let me go back to Professor Coe. Which way do you think this is going to go when it gets to if it gets to the Supreme Court? Will it go with the president or with the state of Washington here?
Oh, it's going to go for the state of Washington. Chris, there's a main point here which is being missed. How do you deal with a terrorist threat? Do you deal with it by a ban on countries, or do you deal with it by visas who are granted to individuals and who are heavily vetted? The system we had was individualized vetting, and there's no proof that that system of individualized vetting wasn't working. In fact, these countries, all the people who would have committed terrorist attacks were vetted out. So the question is, if you don't like that system, why don't you make the vetting system stronger instead of suddenly shifting to a system which bans people based on stereotype, based on religion and national origin?
I agree with that.
It's a lazy way out.
I agree with you, and I think that Secretary Kerry and President Obama, and it would have been, I think, Secretary Clinton, if she were elected, they would have agreed with you. But we had an election, and we have a president who's decreed another way, and we'll test it in court, and that's all part of our constitutional process. But arguing over policy
still has to obey
in the courtroom, I agree with you. You're not going to get me to fight with you about that, Professor. I'm with you on that. But if it gets into a question of the right policy, if it gets to a question of policy and who's smart and who's not, I'd still put my money on the politicians. Anyway, Professor Coe from Yale University.
Chris, your statement, the buck stops with the president. If the president is obeying the law, and if the president has some facts to support what he's doing instead of relying on stereotype or discrimination.
I agree with that, but the day after we had this ruling, the person responsible for the safety of this country is not the judges, it's the president. He's responsible, or she's responsible if it's a woman. They are responsible for the protection of this country if they obey the law. I agree with that. But this consequential, we have to observe the consequence here. Michael Dukakis was a good public servant, and he believed in this furlough program for prisoners in prison for life. And he thought that was a good policy, And Willie Horton got out and raped a woman. And you know what? In the end, the public said they shouldn't have let the guy out.
Come from? Where does the president's
power come from? It comes from the Constitution under Article 2. I understand completely.
And who has the last word on the Constitution?
The Supreme Court under judicial review since Marbury versus Madison. I agree with you. But when I hear the court talking about policy, I wonder if they're beyond their ken.
The Constitution does not provide for judicial analysis of every single issue. There's a body of case law that has to do with standing, that limits who can bring cases and controversies. Body of law that has to do with political question doctrine that says that some issues are free from judicial discernment. It is an utter exaggeration and violation of our structural separation of power provision to say that courts have a last standing and everything. And to me, frankly, it is risible to argue that somehow judges are better able to assess the threat and conclude.
David, you said before we went on, you think that your side will win this argument in the courts.
Yes, I actually am optimistic about the Ninth Circuit. I'm certainly optimistic about the Supreme Court.
Okay, Professor Coe, you believe your side will win. That's sort of the way we do things. We're looking at who's going to win. Professor Coe, again, you believe that the administration will lose this case.
The majority of the courts that have ruled, the vast majority have on this, judges, have already ruled against the president. Remember this, Chris. Donald Trump was a private citizen. He became president. His power comes from the Constitution and the law. If he violates the law, and the court says you're violating the law, he can't do it.
This, the courts are the last word. This is not how this works.
I'm going to have to cut this off. Please come back, gentlemen. Professor Coe, thank you. I agree with you completely, except that I worry about policy decisions made by judges.